Hey there, it's your pal, Bonnie Habian, and welcome to the Worth Knowing podcast. If you like a real-life story that features grit, grace, and a whole lot of gumption, then you're in the right place. Get ready to hear from some courageous women who talk about how pivotal, teachable, aha moments have reshaped their confidence and delivered opportunities they never imagined. It didn't happen by chance, of course. They figured out new, sometimes uncomfortable ways to put themselves out there in a way that shouts, they get it. You'll hear intimate stories with actionable takeaways and some very secret sauce. Because everyone has an important story worth knowing. And you know what? The world needs it, and you deserve it. Today, we have a truly fascinating guest, Marcia Clark, a woman who has been at the center of one of the most infamous trials in American history and has since reinvented herself as a best-selling author. Now, she is here to talk about her latest book, which I absolutely loved. It's called Trial by Ambush, and it was a really fascinating case about this woman who was convicted of murder in 1953, and not so sure she actually convicted that crime. But we're going to dive into that, as well as her professional experiences, career journey, and some of the lessons she's learned along the way. Now, I have one burning question to ask her, and nope, it's not whether she thinks OJ did it or not, but it is a good one. So welcome, Marcia. And I just want to tell you a little bit. I remember being a young woman in my 20s, and I was living in California at the time. My husband was playing for the California Angels. That's the old name of the team. And, I remember watching, some of the trial and thinking to myself as a young woman, like, how in the world did this lady have two small children, take on this incredible case, be under all of this media scrutiny, and still keep her sanity? So although I always was kind of thinking, how did you do it? I was rooting for you all the way. So just wanted to kind of say, during that time, which was some 30 years ago, you've now transitioned into a really different sort of role of being a best-selling author, a speaker. How did that all happen?
By accident. I mean, when I first left the DA's office after the trial, I was a commentator and host for various talk shows. I was a substitute host for Geraldo Rivera on Rivera Live, and I did a lot of that sort of thing. It was just one of those evolving things. I had always wanted to write, and after I'd finished the trial book with a collaborator, Teresa Carpenter, who was an amazing writer, taught me so much, I really wanted to go and write because I had always loved the idea of being an author when I was a kid. And she encouraged me to go ahead and do it. I wanted to do it with her. And she said no. I wanted to write fiction. And so, it was one of those things. It took me a few years to get confident enough to give it a try. But then I finally did. It was one of those now or never, go for it things. So it was kind of one of these things where I did this and I did that and I did this and then finally decided to try to go and do it. Just write a book.
Yeah, it's not easy.
Led to a series.
It's not easy. I mean, it's a daunting task and it's a daunting thought, especially now you've done 9 novels and 2 nonfiction, but the novels themselves, I can't even imagine kind of conceptualizing and taking that from beginning to end. That first book probably took you a few years.
It took me about a year, actually, but it was a year of constant work. It was, get up in the morning. I was also working, taking appellate cases, court-appointed cases. So I was working at the same time, but that meant I had to be very disciplined about you spend this amount of time on the book and this amount of time on your job and, that kind of thing. And I had to be very regimented about it and get my butt in the chair by 7 a.m., no later than every day for quite a while. So it is a lot of work, but I loved it so much. It was so fascinating and intriguing to be able to make up a story, and you draw on experiences, of course, but to be able to decide, how much evidence and what kind of evidence, I didn't have to worry about what they really found. I could go and make it up myself.
You could. That must have felt very empowering.
It was liberating. It was very liberating.
So let's get into Barbara, because I do find her as an interesting character. I need to understand, though, you've seen probably so much crime in your life. What drew you to her in particular? And we're talking about Barbara Graham, who is the central character of this book, real life book called Trial by Ambush.
So it was a complete accident. Again, I feel like my life is filled with these things. But I wanted to write a true crime book. I had not done that, about somebody else's case, not just mine. And I had not done that. And so I was really kind of fascinated by that possibility. So I started looking for one, and I thought it would be an easy thing to do. I thought I had compiled a whole bunch of newspaper articles and, magazine articles and whatnot over the years, and I thought, well, I'll just go back over my archives and I'll find something that's fascinating immediately. And I went back through the articles and everything I'd amassed and found absolutely nothing that was worth writing about at all, because they were all just kind of really sensational in terms of really bizarre crimes and bizarre criminals, but there wasn't much in terms of issues that would still resonate. And I really wanted the book to have more to say than just, ooh, isn't that creepy or isn't that scary? I mean, that just wasn't enough to justify writing a true crime book. It had to have more to it. And then by accident, I stumbled across at the bottom of the page in a footnote of another case I was looking at, Barbara Graham. And I had never heard of her and had never heard of her case. But as soon as I looked into it, I almost thought that was the end of it right there, because what I found out is that Barbara Graham was actually a notorious case. It was its own trial of the century back in 1953, and it had led to an Oscar-winning film called I Want to Live, starring Susan Hayward, who won for Best Actress. And I thought, oh gosh, there's going to be nothing to write here, because everybody and his dog will have written something about the case. So I thought, okay, well, I was about to move on, and then I thought, well, at least look and see what people have written. Well, I found a whole bunch of newspaper articles, but they were awfully sensational in the way they were written. It felt very tabloid. And so I thought, well, that's not the story. And I looked for books about it. There really weren't any. There was one book that had touched on death penalty, her death penalty case, that was about women in the death penalty. A great book, by the way. I recommend it highly. Kathleen Cairns, called Proof of Guilt. But it was about the death penalty, not about the trial itself, and didn't focus particularly on Barbara Graham necessarily. It was about several women. The only other book that was written about it was written by one of the tabloid reporters who happened to be collaborating with the prosecutor, and I thought, okay, that doesn't seem... I read the book.
Very unbiased, right? Yeah.
Right? Exactly. Well, it could have been, but it wasn't.
All right, you read it, so you were like, all right, so this is, yeah, okay, got it.
Very slim volume, and it was also very unreliable. There were things that were that were in the book that I thought, this could never have happened. This is bullshit. And I thought, okay, so really nothing that reliable. There were a couple of episodes of podcasts, but they were very brief, in no depth, and certainly didn't go into the trial. And I thought, okay, so there's something to write about here, because what I wanted to do is write about the trial. You find the truth of the case really lies in what happened in court. And that's where you see all of the evidence that was collected by the detectives, all the statements that were made by witnesses, the defendant, and then what happened in court that caused it to come out the way it did. So that to me is the treasure trove. Well, of course, that was its own kind of crucible, because it's a 70-year-old case. Did they keep the transcripts even? That was the first hurdle. So I was lucky enough to find the clerk's transcript, but that's really just the documents that are filed, the minute orders that are filed. That's not the testimony. I needed the testimony.
Right.
Didn't think I would be able to find it, because my experience with handling so many hundreds of appellate cases is that they don't keep them for longer than 10 years. So I actually called the court reporter's office, got lucky that somebody answered the phone, because these are very busy people. They are hard to find. And she said, well, what was the sentence? And I said, it was a death sentence. She said, oh, we keep those forever.
Oh, gosh.
Oh, my God.
Bingo, right?
Yeah. So I said, okay, so where are they? She goes, I don't know.
Oh, gosh.
And then it became a whole other thing to find out how to find these records. But ultimately, I wound up hiring a very dear friend of mine who's a fabulous researcher, John Valeri, who also manages a lot in my life. And he said, I can do this. And he did. He found the transcripts and then negotiated the getting them from the state archives. No easy thing. And I wound up with them. It took a while, but all 4,000 pages.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I could definitely think you're a very persistent person, so it does not surprise me, right? And I'm sure that's probably one of your superpowers. But let me ask you this. So, I mean, I want to just give the audience a little flavor of what the story's about. I mean, it's not like, I wouldn't say that, the crime itself was anything like, oh my goodness, but it's all the other stuff that's around it that was very interesting to me. So give me a little premise of, because I've read the book, but, tell us a little bit about, from your eyes, the crime at its crux, and then maybe a little bit of the gender bias and sensationalism that was kind of wrapped around that time.
Yeah, so the crime itself was a home invasion robbery. What was stunning about it was in this very quiet residential neighborhood in Burbank, known to be very safe, very family friendly, the kind of place where you'd let your kids play in the front lawn, and we're talking 1950s anyway. But by 1950s standards, it was very much what you'd see on television. Very crime-free, very peaceful, very quiet. But the woman who lived in this house, Mabel Monahan, was a really trippy lady who had been on the vaudeville circuit. She had married her husband, who was also on the vaudeville circuit. They were a dynamic duo, roller skating champs that performed all over the country. And her daughter had married a man named Tudor Scherer, who was a casino entrepreneur who started out in Los Angeles and selling booze at a speakeasy that he formed at a place called Ships, that was a converted ship moored off Santa Monica Pier, and then also tried to run gambling. But Mickey Cohen, the notorious gambler, was owning the gambling business in Los Angeles, and Tudor Scherer decided he would like to stay alive, so decided to open his own place in Las Vegas and became a very successful entrepreneur. He married Mabel's daughter. They ultimately got divorced, and in the settlement, he gave Iris, his daughter, this house in Burbank, this little ranch house in this quiet neighborhood, and Iris gave it to Mabel. So Mabel was living there, but she remained friendly with Tudor Scherer, and he would visit her periodically whenever he came into town. And so the criminal community in Los Angeles, started a rumor that Tudor Scherer was skimming money off his casino operations in Las Vegas and storing them with Mabel. And the rumor built to the point where there was reputedly this safe with hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so they were scheming all along for a couple years about how to knock that place over. They finally did, because they found someone who could get Mabel, who was notoriously security conscious, to open the door. That is Barbara Graham.
Yep.
Petite, beautiful, young. She would go to the door, say, my car broke down, could I please use your phone? Mabel, seeing this woman who seemed non-threatening, opened the door, and 4 men stepped in behind her. Mabel was ultimately found strangled and bludgeoned to death in the house that was found torn up, furniture upended, carpets ripped out, and, just everything, just totally ransacked and trashed. And, in fact, even went through her closet and upended all of her purses with the exception of one purse.
Right.
And that was left hanging on the hook.
Yep. I think that's fascinating, right? Had a lot of stuff in it.
Yeah. It had jewelry, very expensive jewelry, platinum diamonds, and hundreds of dollars in cash. That they left. So the cops at first were like, they had no witnesses, no eyewitnesses, no ear witnesses. They found no fingerprints. They found nothing to go on. And then with all that money still left in the house, they didn't even know why it had happened. So at first, of course, they went after Tudor Scherer thinking there was a connection there, but there wasn't.
Right.
So that's the crime.
Right. And I think the crime in and of itself is not like, oh my God, this is just so interesting, fascinating, the plan. And no, it's just so much more interesting to me while they came to the decision that they came to ultimately as to who was committing the crime and how that all kind of went through. So I think one of the things that I also found interesting is back during that time, most women were somewhat subservient, right? Would be all dressed up, have a nice martini in their hand for the husband that comes home, all prim and perfect. Barbara was not like that. And so I started to wonder and listen to a lot of the different, the story during your book, wondering like, well, how much did that kind of go against her? Is that people are seeing her as almost like, not the norm? And are those sorts of biases inherent when I guess you are actually trying a case?
Yeah, so Barbara had a very rough upbringing. She was basically abandoned by her mother at birth, who kept throwing her out of the house, sending her to one place, strangers basically from the time she was born, family when she could, but strangers when she couldn't find, a place to park Barbara, and then had 2 other children. Barbara never knew her father, neither did her siblings, but there didn't seem to be any real connection between her and her siblings. They got to stay home. Barbara kept getting thrown out. She never got past the 8th grade. She was wound up in a reform school that was basically a dungeon, torture chamber for girls. It was hideous and had been written up a number of times for draconian methods of discipline that came down to waterboarding and torture. So she had a very rough life where she lived on the fringes, never really developed skills, but yet she was very smart and inherently someone who was cultured. She loved jazz music. She loved Omar Khayyam, read the Rubaiyat, loved poetry, loved classical music. It was an amazing and sad thing that she had so much to offer and so much to give, but no one who cared. And so she lived on the fringes, which meant that she amassed a kind of rap that the people on the fringes do, all misdemeanor, nonviolent stuff. Shoplifting, check kiting, a little bit of prostitution here and there, minor drugs, that sort of thing, but no violence in her background at all.
Right.
She became friendly with Emmett Perkins, who ran a gambling house. And she became his dice girl, so to speak, which was a shill. She would get men to part with their money. But, her life, she could not have survived the life she had she not become kind of tough and strong. And somebody who was not going to suffer fools gladly. As a result, She did not conform to the subservient, meek, kind of yes dear woman that was held to be.
I don't think you and I would either. I don't think I'd like that very much.
No, no, but that's okay today, largely okay, although, sometimes I wonder. But, but it's certainly more okay today than it was then.
Well, yeah. And one of the things that really struck a nerve with me is that you brought up something so fascinating that I don't think about, but it's so true. A case is not just a case. There are societal, cultural wins, political wins that surround that case that do have an impact. So what do you think that jury saw because of some of those wins that were around that time period?
Well, so this is interesting to me. She actually dressed in the style that was most fashionable then, with a tight skirt suit, jacket and skirt and high heels. That was very much in fashion then. And wore makeup that was also in fashion. Her hair pulled back in a bun. There's nothing that I could say that would really be inappropriate in the way she looked, other than she was beautiful. And I think the fact that she dressed to accentuate that in a way that looked very tasteful to me, honestly, but they didn't approve of that. They were looking for someone, as I wrote about in the book, it's more like a Casey Anthony situation.
Yeah.
Casey, who was wet t-shirt contest and all the rest, but when she came to court, no makeup, hair up in a bun with a shirt buttoned up to her nose, she couldn't have looked more like, less like a wet t-shirt contestant than she did. So they were looking for that, and looking for her basically in sackcloth and ashes to be ashamed and, and
right.
the rest of it, to, look humbled by the situation. And she didn't. Yeah. She just looked wonderful. And then, of course, when she took the stand and she was cross-examined by the prosecutor, and she gave as good as she got, and boy, did he give it to her. Instead of basically caving under and weeping and, being submissive, she shot right back at him. And I don't think that endeared her either, because, again, that wasn't the way. And don't forget, the press was also amplifying this whole demon, villainous, temptress, seductress, and also this vicious bloody Babs, she got called, because she was framed up by the one guy who turned.
Yes.
One of the men who did the actual home invasion robbery framed her as the one who did the pistol whipping of the victim.
And I love his last name.
Yeah. Yeah, John True. I call him,
right?
Ironically named John True, the biggest liar you ever met. But they couldn't crack the case without him. And he got up and he testified that she was the one who did the vicious pistol whipping of this elderly woman and made her seem like a vile demon. So all of this was trumpeted by the press enormously. They sensationalized the case. Barbara's picture was above the fold everywhere you looked. And they were publishing newspapers then in morning and in the afternoon, and in places where the jury couldn't really have avoided them. Back then they put newspapers in these glass cases, and there were a ton of them right around the courthouse. So all you had to do was walk past them to see these blaring headlines and the photographs, bloody Babs being plastered all over the place. And the jury couldn't help but see it. That there was no cover for her. And, the society at that time surely didn't approve of a woman who was reputed to be that vicious, and not only that, but that tough. But that wasn't enough. While she was in jail, awaiting trial, she was set up by the lead investigator, who had his girlfriend, who had been busted for basically decimating a family of 5 in a drunk driving accident, for which she got a whole 1 year in jail. He had her sidle up to Barbara in jail and try to persuade her to secure a false alibi with an undercover cop. And in the course of that sidling up to Barbara, they became lovers. And she kept all of Barbara's love letters, and that was used also to besmirch her character with the jury that back in the 1950s did not think kindly of women who had female partners.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm looking back and I look at how time has changed, I think I've heard you say in some respect, you don't think she would have been sentenced to death today. What do you think that's kind of changed a little bit, not from just the society, but really not violating certain rights or maybe following the letter of the law a little bit more? I'm not sure.
Well, the way the trial was conducted had something to do with it. I mean, yes, society's mores, seeing a woman step outside step off the pedestal that they wanted to put them on, and it was such a double-edged sword. You step off that pedestal to your peril, so they would demonize her. It was devil or angel, but there was nothing in between. She could not just be a human who was flawed and had a tough life, and which explained a great deal of what she would call her kind of rough around the edges persona, but she was also very intelligent. And a lot of that was unacceptable in society. So she started out with 3 strikes against her, and of course then got demonized further by being the one who supposedly wielded the pistol that whipped Mabel Monahan into a bloody pulp. So there was all of that. The prosecutor was allowed to take full advantage of that,
Right.
On cross-examination and throughout the trial in many, many ways. And all of that painted her as someone who was beyond redemption. So it was all of the above that was allowed to transpire, that a lot of which would not have been allowed in today's world at all. And even if some of it had, for example, having a female lover would not have been as big a deal in
No.
today's world as it was back then. But back then, she was not even a human because of that. So there were so many things that, and I think the prosecutor, even given the more relaxed laws back then governing prosecutorial conduct in court and legal obligations that a prosecutor had, even though they were more relaxed, there were ways in which the prosecutor stepped over the line that would have been unacceptable even then. He never got caught. So a lot of these things combined led to the death, the jury voting for death. Whereas today, the combination of a prosecutor would never be allowed to do such things, and we also feel differently about so many things, including what a woman should be and must be, that would have led to a different result today.
Okay. Well, I have this burning question I want to ask you. It's all kind of tied in some respects to kind of how things have changed. But, you yourself probably have a very interesting life, to many of us. In terms of kind of where your career trajectory has gone and what you've experienced in life, tell me kind of what your life was like before the OJ trial and what changed after. Is it 2 parts of your life, or do you look back at it differently now?
Before Simpson, I was a prosecutor, loved my job. I had gotten into the special trials unit, which handled all of the complex murder cases, tended to be high profile, but high profile back then didn't mean cameras in the courtroom.
Right,
It meant
exactly.
maybe the press showed up at
Exactly.
arraignment, right? And maybe they showed up at the time of the verdict, but probably not. They might get your name right. They might not get your name at all. Certainly they would never take your picture. So that's, the special trials unit being high profile cases simply meant that they were complex and they were interesting, and they took a lot of time. I mean, there was one trial I was in for 2 years. It's a long time to be in trial. And that was my life, and I loved it. And there was no being recognized on the street. It was wonderful.
Right.
And then there was Simpson. And from very early on in the case, it became very clear this was a whole new world, something I'd never experienced before and never wanted to, and something that was really horrible for the pursuit of justice in a criminal trial, which was all of this attention from the media.
Yeah.
Very little of which was any good for the administration of justice, because it was naturally sensationalizing and therefore distorting of the truth. And witnesses came forward who really had nothing to say. Witnesses most likely hid from the cameras and who had something to say. There was just everything about it was bizarro world. And then, of course, being somebody that was recognized on the street, which was shocking and really hard to accept.
Yeah, I'd imagine. And imagine your life did take a different trajectory. But in some respects, when we look at ourselves holistically, whether we're, the lead prosecutor on one of the most famous trials in the world, or just someone working really hard to get to their next steps, we all go through these kind of transformations. And it sounds like you were saying, you've come upon these things by accident, right? I don't think you really expected this was going to happen to you, kind of, the notoriety you've gained. It seems to lead you to another place. So I'm trying to kind of also appeal to those who are listening, just say, hey, listen, sometimes crazy stuff happens, right? It's all about resilience. It's all about kind of helping it, work for yourself. Do you have any kind of guidance there for folks who are listening? Because you've been through a lot, Marcia.
You know what? I try not to think about that, Bonnie.
Well, no, you're a role model in many ways. All I'm saying is that, listen, I can't even imagine. I can't. Having 2 small children, going through what you went through, having scrutiny, people looking, that's kind of got to be like, feeling like you're going to the grocery store with no clothes on all the time, right? No one likes that. But I mean, it has taught you something. You're probably stronger than you ever thought you were.
I think, you learn what you can endure by enduring it. And there's even a prayer that says, God, please don't give me all that I can take.
Yeah.
Something like that. I'm paraphrasing. And I think that you learn a lot about yourself the more you go through horrible things, hard things, upsetting, scary things. And going through that trial was an unending nightmare. There was No day I walked into court where I didn't know that some bomb would explode and things would happen that should never happen in a trial. And a judge who would just not rein in the defense and would not, support, that would not enforce the rules that are necessary for a trial to proceed fairly and appropriately. And it was awful to watch justice just get flushed down the drain and yet get up and do it again and again.
I know.
And again.
And look not affected, right? And then, it's just, So, I just think that alone, going through that, was quite remarkable to watch. And I think going back to the Barbara scenario as well, that wasn't on camera, but that was a different sort of sensationalism. And she, like other women, if she's been beaten enough or, beaten down enough, has this exterior, because how else are you going to survive? So, I think reflecting back kind of on the 30-year anniversary of OJ, the more than 60 years from Barbara's case, what lessons have we learned maybe just from a legal standpoint, or any lessons you feel like, you look back and say, I've done so much work studying, trying cases. I've learned one or two things about the human spirit or about law.
That's a very big question. Maybe we can narrow it down a little bit. As far as being resilient and kind of overcoming or dealing with the vagaries of life, some of which are good, most of which are not, it's really, to me, it's a matter of putting one foot in front of the other, but being willing to get up and try again and get up and try again, but also being open to other ways of doing things and other opportunities in your life. Life changes. Things change for you in life, and what you have to do is roll with the punches and look for the opportunities. And I've always thought, the way to live your life is to create choices for yourself as much as possible and do what you think you can't do. Like, what do they say? Trying is lying. I don't believe that's true. I think that sometimes you do have to try something, but you try with the idea in mind that you're going to do it, not just try with the idea that it doesn't matter. I'm not going to, really give it any effort. You go into it thinking, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this, and we'll see how it works out, and be willing to fail. I think that's it.
Yeah.
Understanding that if you fail, you will not die. You will survive.
You won't. You're right.
You will, and you will. And in that process of surviving, you'll find strength in yourself, and you'll find an ability to be flexible and be resilient and open up new opportunities, new choices for yourself. You have to be willing, though, to see those choices and those opportunities and not be afraid to jump off that cliff. That's probably my biggest learning experience, because leaving the DA's office was a jumping off the cliff. It was really scary. I knew what I did every day.
Yeah,
I got up, I went to court, and I went to court all day, and then I went home, and then I got ready for the next case, and then stepping out of the office. And it took me a long time. I had months of overtime, as you can imagine, that had accrued. And by the time they called me to say, you're leaving, right? Because by that time I was hosting shows and stuff, and I said, I don't know. And they said, are you crazy? What's wrong with you?
Well, that's who you are. That's what you knew yourself to be, right? It's really hard. It's a very big part of our identity, especially when you work really hard to build something. I totally get it. And so one final question I want to ask you about the book. Why should people read it? What do you think, for the reasons that you wrote it, what do you think is the biggest takeaway they may get from reading about Barbara Graham?
Biggest takeaway is the importance of justice and the importance of the truth. The importance of a trial appropriately tried, of everybody kind of following the rules that are so necessary to ensure that a defendant gets a fair trial, that the people get a fair trial. This goes for both sides, and that the truth will only come out if it's allowed to. So to understand that it's really important to protect these rules that we have, and that we are seeking justice constantly. The changes in the law that have occurred since her case have made trials more fair for both sides, has made it easier for the truth to be protected and to be presented to the jury, so the jury gets a chance to make the right decision. The importance of that, the importance of following the rules of law. I hope people come away with seeing how that's necessary. It's the foundation for our system of justice.
And on that note, I'm going to thank Marcia Clark for this absolutely fascinating 30 minutes. I truly appreciate your time. I highly recommend the book. I would say that it's one of those quick reads, and if you're a crime junkie like me, you just can't put it down. So thank you, Marcia Clark. I wish you tremendous success, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Bonnie. It's been a pleasure.